Chapter 25. Bedeviled. GDP and the national debt.
The statistics and data of the U.S. economy and the taxation of its residents are remarkable to consider, especially when viewed from a distance. Today, the number of people living in the U.S. comprises about 5% of the world's population, or over 360 million people. Yet stunningly, the U.S. produces 20% of the world's gross domestic product, GDP, to the tune of about $26 trillion. How is this possible? There are several factors at work, one of which is that the U.S. sells a lot of products and services within the global economy outside the country. Many of the U.S.'s largest companies make a significant amount, or even a majority, of their gross revenue from sales outside the U.S. Consider the performance of Apple, the largest company in the world by market capitalization, which generates over 60% of its sales revenue internationally. The earth-moving equipment manufacturer Caterpillar also generates over 50% of its revenue outside the U.S., and Walmart, the company with the greatest gross revenue in the world, derives over 30% of its revenue outside the U.S. Today, the U.S. holds 20% of the world's money supply, or about $15.5 trillion, which is in line with its producing 20% of the world's GDP. So the U.S. would seem to be in an enviable position of being a global economic powerhouse. However, some other data paints a less rosy picture. Despite the massive amount of wealth held by the U.S., we cannot seem to balance our own books. The national debt has become almost a political punchline. It has been hotly debated and alternatively ignored. It has been agonized over and blown off. It's often used as a political weapon for one party to attack the other, and then promptly dismissed when that same party assumes power over the federal budget. But here's the thing. We're playing with fire. Every day that we rack up additional debt with absolutely no strategy for reining in this problem, which is every single day, becomes another day. We are gambling with the entire future of the U.S. And as any gambler can tell you, lucky streaks inevitably come to an end. Since the Great Depression, the U.S. has seen its national debt rise and fall as a percentage of GDP. In 1943, the national debt was about 102% of GDP, and by the late 1970s and early 1980s it had dropped and started to rise again, reaching 60% of GDP in 1981. Today, our national debt of over $33 trillion has climbed to the dangerous heights of over 120% of our $25.5 trillion GDP. We need to recognize that the national debt has historically risen and fallen in a path that directly tracks with the legislative shifts of our tax burdens upon individuals and corporations. Look at the graph below and note how the national debt rises in a pattern that matches congressional shifting over the years. The increasing reliance on individual income taxes on salaries, and the declining assessment of taxes on corporations from 1944 until today. The parallels are stunning. As we have seen, this tracking path also mirrors fluctuations in the wealth gap and the decline in the younger generation's ability to earn more than their parents, the strangling of the American dream. Correlation of rising income taxes, declining corporate taxes, and the rising percentage of U.S. national debt as a percentage of U.S. GDP. To see the graph of correlation of rising income taxes, go to the disruptingtaxes.org website. The relationship of a country's debt to its GDP is monitored by nations and international institutions as a guidepost for that country's economic health, similar to how a corporation's financial health is compared to its debt as a ratio of its gross revenue. In 1980, the total U.S. national debt was $5 trillion, and the GDP was $15 trillion, a ratio of only 33%. Today, with our national debt of $34 trillion plus, an amount at over 120% of GDP, We are headed to a wall we have never seen in our 235-year history. And what's worse, we see that on average our national debt rises at 4% per year, while our GDP only rises on average about 2% per year. Make no mistake, this trend is mathematically unsustainable, and the price for our fiscal negligence will be paid by our children and their children. Alarm bells are now ringing in the heads of observers, economists, credit holders, and businesses. Today, under a non-emergency budget, the U.S. spends approximately $6 trillion annually, but collects only around $4 trillion annually, a difference which increases the national debt by about $2 trillion or so annually. If we step back and take a 10,000-foot view of our tax system, the complex and convoluted structure informs a simple question. How should we extract $6 trillion from the economy to cover all the costs of running the federal government, so that we also do not borrow $2 trillion annually and add to the national debt? Increasing the tax rate on salaries is not the right path, as in fact, this has been a cause which in part contributes to the suppression of the American dream. Raising taxes directly on corporations has not been politically possible since 1944, and reducing the size of the federal government budget is not significantly possible, as debt services and interest on the national debt, now costing $1 trillion annually, military spending, Social Security, and Medicare are all politically impossible to cut, and leaves just a small fraction of the federal budget open to reductions. So in light of these limitations, the question becomes, what is the fairest and most equitable and most efficient manner to extract $6 trillion annually from the economy? If we can extract $6 trillion from the economy, this should cover all the costs of the federal government, including annual payments on the national debt. If we can find a way, then one day our national mortgage will be paid off, and your children and grandchildren will be freed from the burden of the debt. So based upon all these present factors, which is the best tax system to most effectively and equitably extract $6 trillion from the economy? Do we extract $6 trillion from the $12.5 trillion of salaries? If we did this, then the average individual burden on your salary would be 48% of your income. Do we extract $6 trillion from the $25.5 trillion GDP, which includes salaries? This would create a 24% burden across the economy, including individuals' salaries and corporate revenues, but would also be a difficult type of taxation to implement. Remember that the last time individuals and companies shared the tax burden was 1944. Or do we consider a new structure where we can extract $6 trillion from a tax base of $600 trillion, all banking transactions in the economy, through a 1% tax, the ABT tax? This would be far less painful because everyone pays: individuals, companies, visitors, drug lords, criminals, everyone contributes. Tax options to achieve a balanced budget of $6 trillion. To see these pie charts, go to the disruptingtaxes.org website. Let's look more deeply. Let's look at the past 20 years for additional insight into what awaits us with our current trends. The U.S. population has grown roughly 1% a year over the past 20 years. As we have seen, the GDP has grown roughly 2% a year over the same period. Looking at the U.S. money supply, it has grown about 3% per year for the past 20 years. And because we have a larger share of the world's money supply, that is larger than our population warrants, we also have a greater potential to equitably tax the flow of money in our economy. This is especially true when considering the possibilities of a broad tax base that taxes far beyond individual salaries. Note that the key to growing the GDP, a desire of every nation, is not rooted in the often espoused method of tax cuts. Rather, the GDP of a developed nation grows when the population grows in tandem with a money supply that grows in a calculated manner. Assuming that a nation has in place the elements of established systems of government, that is, rule of law, resources, enforcement of contracts, protection of property rights, etc. If the population does not grow with a nation's birth rate, then it must grow based upon immigration. And as our history makes clear, robust legal immigration should be considered a fundamental element of the American dream. Regardless of how it is achieved, it is critical that the nation's leaders address the problem of restructuring our tax system to equitably extract the revenue needed to run the government while also paying down the national debt. Remember, the national debt is borrowing from your children's future to artificially support the economic vibrancy of today. This can be seen in the strong financial performance of the stock market over the past 10 years, a product in part from the corporate tax avoidance made legally possible under the current tax laws. Current laws allow companies to keep artificially enormous profits, which in turn triggers rising stock share prices, a direct reflection of oversized profits due to a lacking tax burden, and artificially creates improved stock price to earnings or PE ratios, causing markets to surge. Our world is truly interconnected. With no taxes being paid by companies, the nation has had to borrow money to cover its budget without a guarantee that future generations will be able to repay these extraordinary loans we are taking today. Do not forget the promises made to you when Congress passed the special interest tax cuts, which stated that these cuts would increase government revenue and pay down on the debt. These trickle-down tax cuts have never worked, and so the national debt has increased and become a burden your children and grandchildren will have to pay, in one manner or another. And heaven forbid, if the U.S. ever defaulted on our national debt, the economy would be in a calamity, undermining all the hard-earned faith and opportunities that our forebears have developed over the generations and passed on to us